could, or you could wait for the end.
That's true.
Maybe we should wait for the end, keep people sticking around. Anyway, you can decide what you feel is more effective. I will give you that choice.
Sounds good.
But it's not about the Cubs, Karen. I can tell you that. Okay. So anyway, welcome to everyone who is here. And I saw by watching chat this morning that there are a number of people here who are newbies. Welcome. You're very much welcome here. As you'll find out, we have a conversation every Thursday morning. I talk for about 30 minutes, then we open things up for a discussion. Often it's plugged into the news, but in one way or another, we talk about the past and then talk about how that can help us better understand the present. And today we are going to be talking about how the heck do we talk about what's going on right now with students or with kids. I'll get into why that became a topic shortly, but before I do that, I shall turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game before we start.
Absolutely. So the rules of the game are, and I'm going to mention these and then I'll go to my big news. It looks like folks want it early because some folks have to leave. So excuse me. So rules of the game, as always, please put things into chat. We'd love to hear your comments, hear about anything going on. That is, of course, and germane to our conversation here today. If you do have questions for Joanne, then make sure that you put those into the Q&A section. That's where I get the questions from. So make sure you put all questions into Q&A. That way we can make sure we get to them. It's how we make sure that we don't miss anything in the chat. And as always, if you do like what we do here at the National Council for History Education, please make sure to visit us on the web, www.ncheteach.org, and look around, become a member, check out all of our great events. And of course, follow us on social media. For those of you who don't, we're at History Ed on Twitter, and on Facebook, we are NC4HE, the number 4HE. So please make sure you join one of our pages and just see what kind of stuff we have out there. And which brings me to my big important news, which I'm really glad I can finally share. Folks, mark your calendars. December 17th. December 17th is the day, and there'll be more on this in the future. You should see lots of marketing from us on this, but we have an incredible event. We're pleased that we can welcome Pete Souza for an event. For those of you who don't know who Pete Souza is, he is the former photographer for Presidents Reagan and Obama. And he's going to do a event with us, including Q&A, on December 17th about photographs as primary sources. So it's going to be a really, really, really cool thing. Yes, and if you don't know who he is, he does have a new movie out about him, about his most recent work. And of course, he has a huge Instagram following for those of you who are on there. So really, really excited to have that. I don't want to overshadow the rest of the day, but I did want to get that out there.
It is amazing. It's totally amazing. And
amazing.
His photographs are also amazing. He does have a really huge Instagram account, which I follow. But that's really exciing. And
yeah,
that's great career for NCHE.
It's well, it's all thanks to generous. We were able to shift some funding from the Library of Congress, and so we want to give credit to them. They were on board with this, and that's been really excited. So
yay!
So that's our big news, and you'll see a lot more in the coming weeks about that. But I want to share with our community here first, because we've built this wonderful little community here. So
that is wonderful news. So I'm glad that you did it, because I know people had to leave.
Yes,
and that would be not fair.
Yep. Yeah, and Laura reminds us that this is the last weekend to get a proposal into the NCHE April conference. So make sure you do that. And try to think, yeah.
Okay. That's wonderful. Thank you, Laura, for reminding us of that. Okay. shall we turn to the subject?
Yes, please do. I'm going to hide away and let Joanne take over here because this is just really the letter she has. If you haven't read it, is amazing. So
it's a fave. Okay. December 17th is the date. Yes. Okay. So move this out of the way here. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome to everybody. I want to talk for just a second about why this topic came up. Normally, I try over the weekend or even sometimes as late as Monday or Tuesday to find a topic that relates to what's going on. And normally that's really not very hard because something is happening about every 45 minutes. However, this week, the reason I came to the topic about how we talk about the swirling storm of crises that are surrounding us, two things. So number one thing is kind of an obvious thing, which is we're coming up, believe it or not, on the actual election, and something will happen, maybe if not on that day, shortly thereafter. At some point, someone will be declared a victor and then something will happen. And realizing that that was on the horizon, and one of my undergraduates said to me, the election's kind of close. And I said, yeah. And he said, what are you going to do the day after it for class? And I realized not only is the election close and not only are we going to have stuff to talk about, but my class, what are we going to do with students? Not only for that, but that in particular brought it to mind. So I actually went on Twitter, where I spend far too much time, and I asked, what are people out there doing, or are they doing anything on their syllabus for the day after the election or the week of the election? And I got a wide range of responses. A lot of people, and maybe it's self-selection, and the people who beamed in were people who had decided to do something, I don't know, although some people said they weren't going to change anything. Other people said their classroom topic that week that they were going to discuss was so related to what was going on that they really didn't feel the need to change anything. But a lot of people said, some said they're just going to cancel class that day and Tuesday. Some said they're going to cancel class that week. Some said they were reducing reading loads. And some said they were not going to have any reading for the week, but they were going to, and they were going to have a, how do I want to call this? There was going to be an open class discussion if you wanted to attend and no penalty if you didn't want to. Obviously, in one way or another, I think everybody is going to be feeling a little overwhelmed by those days, the day of the election, the few days that follow. I don't think anyone really can forget 2016. So, I think teachers, we will be feeling that too. In the end, that's what I opted to do. I told my students yesterday, my undergrads, that I switched the readings to another week for them that we would have done that day. And I told them that I would be there during the Zoom class space. I would just be there. And if people wanted to show up to have a conversation about what was happening or about what they were thinking or about what they were feeling, they could come. If they didn't, that was fine. I did that partly because other people said so on Twitter, and I found it comforting that other people were doing that. The other reason I did it is because in 2016, obviously unexpected things happened. And in advance of the election, 3 history faculty members at Yale had agreed to do a public event for students and I suppose faculty if they wanted to come about the election. And 3 of us, 3 historians, 3 women, and we thought we were going to stand up and talk about the first woman president, which is not what happened. So we did the event, but given the unexpected outcome of the election, it wasn't a normal event. So it was it was in a kind of, in one of Yale's beautiful auditoriums with like Tiffany windows, and it was a space. But it was full. There were students on the floor. There were people in the hallway who couldn't get into the room. I mean, it was quite a thing. People wanted to know what was going to be said. And the thing that struck me about that day was the fact that students, the outcome was so unexpected for the students. And I think for some of them, probably it was their first real engagement in politics in a serious way. They were unsettled and scared because they just didn't know what to do with an unexpected result, with that particular unexpected result. There was so much emotion in that room, and the students were so unsettled, doesn't do it justice. And upset isn't quite the right word. The mood, the feeling was really fraught, and they were looking to the three of us, the three professors, to somehow give them answers. And some of the questions they were asking were really penetrating questions that kind of broke my heart that they felt the need to ask them. Newbie really felt bad about it too, even though he wasn't there. At any rate, thinking back to 2016, thinking back to the intense emotional response that I know it wasn't just students having, but seeing that and feeling responsible somehow for interpreting that moment for them, that combined with my students saying what happens the day after the election in our class led me to begin thinking seriously. Oh, noobs, you're coming. Led me to begin thinking seriously about what do we do with these kinds of intense moments. The election is one intense one. Oh, newbie. For those of you who are new, I have a rescue parakeet who really likes it when I talk on Zoom, and sometimes he's good and sometimes he's not. We're going to hope he quiets down. At any rate, we have so many crises and so many things at the moment to talk about that I'm sure we have been talking about already up until now, but I thought this would be a good moment to broach this. I could talk a little bit about it. It also gave me an excuse. Yeah, distraught is good as a word to describe the atmosphere. Newbie is indeed getting nervous about the election. So I came up with the topic, and then I realized once I came up with the topic, it gave me an excuse to use one of my favorite, and of course, I probably have an infinite number of one of my favorite pieces of primary evidence, but this particular one, somehow it haunts me. I think about it often. I've tried to find it a couple of times in the recent past and couldn't, and I did find it for today, which is good because it's sort of a great example of someone confronting and addressing to a kid about a really fraught topical issue. So let me set up the letter and then tell you a little bit about what it says. And it's up, it's posted on the same website where you got the link to get here. So if you want to see it or if you want to use it for classes, there are no chirps included. Newbie. Okay. I don't know. I think that's happy, but whatever it is, he has strong feelings about it. Okay. So this is a letter from Anson Burlingame. He's a member of Congress. He comes to Congress in 1855 and he leaves in 1861. He was a Republican. He was a Republican with two kids, and one was named Edward, who this letter is to. So he's a Republican. He's a heartfelt Republican. It's clear from this letter that Eddie, his son, had written to him a little while back, but a lot had been happening, and Anson Burlingame had wanted to respond and hadn't. Now, the day when he wrote this letter, February 20th, 1858, something had happened in the House of Representatives, not that long before this, maybe 10-ish days before this, that helps explain in part the letter. So this is in the middle of the Kansas debate about whether Kansas was going to be Nebraska-Kansas Act, whether Kansas was going to be a free or a slave state. Really intense discussion, ends up really fueling the rise of the Republican Party. This is the moment, this is the background for what's going on here. And a week, 10 days before the letter, in the House of Representatives, there had been an enormous fight in which a Republican congressman with the wonderful 19th century name Galusha Grow had been standing amidst Democrats, had been standing, and Southerners. And while he happened to be standing there, someone said something out of order and he objected. That it was out of order. And a fellow, his last name was either Ket or Kite, and I never know how to pronounce it, from South Carolina, stood up and said something along the lines of, object on your own side of the house. Like, get out of here. Like, don't stand amongst us and offer that kind of assertion. So Grow, who was a really not belligerent, but aggressive Republican, newbie, he's now flapping all over the place. Grow said out loud in a belligerent tone of voice, "I'm not going to listen to some damn slave driver. It's a free house." Okay, so that's an uh-oh moment. And Kit, who may very well have been a little drunk because this was an evening session, which means he'd already gone to dinner and come back. And a lot of congressmen did that and then came back drunk. He stood up and he walked over to Grow and grabbed his collar as though he was going to punch him. And Grow hit him first and knocked him flat. And at that moment, this is such a, there's that fraught and distraught, this in this case, fraught moment between North and South, and the new Republican Party is basically, to not put it in an eloquent way, freaking out the Southerners in the House of Representatives when they saw one of their number knocked flat, and even worse, by a Republican. They began streaming across the House of Representatives to the site of the battle. And when Republicans saw Southerners running over, they assumed that this was a mass Southern attack on their fellow on Galusha Grow. So they began, in the words of someone who was there at the time, jumping over desks and chairs to get to the spot as quickly as they could. And what you ended up with was a free-for-all, enormous brawl with congressmen running from all over the house and slugging each other and throwing spittoons. There's kind of a slapstick component to this too. But really, you know, a battle that ultimately broke down in laughter because someone mistakenly pulled someone else's, grabbed him by the hair to punch him in the face, and his toupee came off. That's like worthy of any slapstick movie in the world. People started to laugh and it broke up. And some people said, okay, we're going to sit down and it's fine. And some people said that looked like a battle. That was a group of Northerners and a group of Southerners running at each other on the House floor, and many of them were armed. So that's what happens a little bit before this wonderful letter gets sent. So Eddie, Anson Burlingame's son, is about 10 years old at this point. So Burlingame says, I got your beautiful letter. I've been trying to respond to it. He comments that I suppose back home, and he's from Massachusetts, there had been a bridge that had been dedicated as free. And he says, I'm working hard to do something for freedom by making a speech if I can get the floor. Freedom is good and is opposed by slavery, which is bad. Slavery takes little boys like you and Walter, his other son, and sells them away from their parents. Freedom lets them stay at home and go to school, just as you are doing. There is a great country called Kansas, and the people who love slavery wish to put it there, and the people who love freedom wish to keep it out. I am on one side, and Mr. Kit, who had trouble with Mr. Grow, is on the other. The people who love slavery and are in earnest, and those who love freedom are in earnest. This makes them try to beat each other by making speeches against each other and by voting against each other. Sometimes men like Mr. Kit get so angry as to forget that they are the representatives of the people and become bad blackguards and strike men who will not do as they wish to have them. Grandpa will tell you all about these things. I'm sure Grandpa must have been like, gee, thanks, son. I'll explain congressional violence to good old Eddie. You must try to govern yourself and educate yourself so that it shall never be said of you, he is a blackguard. Now, that letter stuck in my mind. I found it in Anson Burlingame's letters years ago at the Library of Congress. And I was looking for congressional violence, not for letters to sons. And there was all kinds of other stuff in the Burlingame papers. It's actually the Anson, Burlingame, and family papers. So for this reason, I suppose this was in there too. Sometimes family items get removed from a congressman's collection, which is always a mistake, as that would show in this case. But it's such a striking example of a father trying to explain really, fraught, intense, divisive, in this case, violent issues that are tearing the country apart to a 10-year-old kid the way he does it is just so earnest and simple in a way. Somehow or other, that letter stayed with me forever. When I had a fellowship at the New York Public Library, I had that up on the wall because it represented such a human moment amidst a crisis, right? So we think of Kansas, Nebraska, the bloody shirt, the caning of Sumner. We have a whole slew of phrases we can throw out about that moment. But a letter from a father to a son about how to think about it, that puts our discussion and our understanding of it on a completely different level. So that's why I wanted to bring that forward. And that's what I really wanted to frame our larger discussion in. Now, historically speaking, I tried after I found that letter, when I was thinking about what else I would do in this preparatory conversation, I thought, how many other times have I seen kids appear in the letters and papers of, in my case, members of Congress, since that's where I've been a lot lately. And I could think of only two, but they're interesting for similar reasons. They're not quite as striking as this, but I remember reading Charles Sumner's papers, and there was a folder of papers from constituents and others after he was caned. And there was a letter from a little boy, and it said something like, I actually didn't think of it until very late yesterday, so I couldn't find it for today, but I remember it. I'm very good at remembering letters. It said something like, I heard what happened to you, and I heard it at school, and I was so upset that I started to cry at school, and I didn't know what to do, and I asked my parents, and it makes me want to come, to Washington to help you. It was a school kid, a boy, who was clearly so emotionally upset and not entirely sure of the meaning of what was going on, but it felt personal to him. It was a striking letter, again, which is why I remembered it. The only other instance I could think of with children responding to current events actually has to do with Kansas. And I found one congressman's, let's see, this is, I'm not going to remember who it is. It's a northern congressman whose son, who is not 10, was a little older, but was still in school, heard about what was going on in Kansas and decided he wanted to go to Kansas to help the free state people make Kansas a free state. So he fled to Kansas and he just went. And apparently there were, over the course of my research, one or two other sons, school age or maybe college age, who did that, who just left home and went to Kansas. And in this particular case, this father, within the papers was a stream of letters. The father went running off to Kansas to find his son, and was writing home to relatives. And it was a huge thing, trying to get a hold of his son, and also explain to him why that wasn't the best thing to do at this moment. But it was such again, another family moment in the midst of a historical event that we sort of take for granted. It is important. It was an important, predecessor of the Civil War, blah, 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 from up here. And all of these discussions of children in one way or another are such a reminder about the ground level impact and the ways in which individuals have to struggle with events like pandemics or political anxiety and dissension, or really important elections, or fill in the blank for all of the swirling things that we're going through right now. It's pretty distinctive. Anyway, so that was my thought for what we're doing today. What I found when I told my students that I was going to do this, they looked relieved that they would be able to come and talk about it. The other thing that I thought about that also I thought would inform today's discussion is at the beginning of the semester. So I'm very diligent about not including my politics in my teaching, because I know there are students in my classes who don't agree with me, and I want them to not feel like the other in my classes. Now, I talk about things that are, I'm talking about early America. So yesterday in my class, we talked about protest and the significance of protest to democracy. In the current environment, that might be a politicized issue. I'm not talking about the current moment. I'm talking about early America. However, I've been very stringent about this, just because I just want people in the class to feel like they are in the class, that there can be open discussion. And for that very reason, people with different views can actually talk to each other. That happens so rarely. So anyway, that's been like a real policy with me. I don't normally announce it. Sometimes I'll say at the beginning of the semester something like, you know, this is a respectful place, but if you have different views about things, we can talk about those things, and, you know, there'll be no sniping in the classroom or whatever else. And there's never been a threat of that. So it's worked very well for me. This year, I gave my speech at the beginning of the semester to my undergrads. This is a safe space. You can think what you want to think. We're going to really focus on the past, and the past events certainly is going to trigger ways that we think about the present. But we aren't going to be talking about the present. We're going to be talking about the past. And after that entry that was like maybe the first day of the course, the introduction, a student came up to me and said, I heard what you said about staying out of the present. I can't stay out of the present. I can't. I don't know how to do that. Not right now. And that hit me in the heart, right? Of course you can't. The student was someone who just felt so, and in some ways personally invested in events, that for me to say, let's not think about that, it just didn't seem like a workable suggestion. So here's what I'm doing this year that I've never done before. And so far, I think it's working. We stay in the past, we talk about books, we talk about primary documents, and the last 20 minutes or so, sometimes a half hour of class, we stop talking about the past and we open up a conversation about how that past exploration, kind of like we do here on History Matters, how that conversation about the past might help us think differently about the present. So yesterday we talked about protest in the 1790s and different views about it, and who was comfortable with it and who wasn't comfortable with it. We then talked about different views about protest now, not a partisan conversation, but a really searching conversation. And so every week there has been about a half hour of an open space for students to talk about whatever the reading is making them think about the present. And I think it's been working nicely. I have them send me questions or ideas or thoughts that occurred to them about the present when they're reading whatever we're reading for class, so that they're guiding the discussion. I'm not introducing my interests or my feelings. They tell me what they're thinking about, and I pull that stuff together and open that space. I think it's been really good. I mean, at the end of the semester, at some point I'm going to ask them for a real response to that. But what it feels like to me, and yesterday's discussion was so good that we went long. We went beyond the end of class time. I just think it's so rare to have spaces where you can really talk about things, and particularly where students can just ask questions that they're probably afraid to ask in some other spaces, or vent, like, this makes me feel this, and have other students say, yeah, me too, and have me say, well, there's a logical reason to feel that, because it feels like a healthy space. I don't know if I'll keep doing it, but in the climate that we're in, it feels necessary. So with that, I'm going to pause for a moment, because I think this particular subject is particularly needs open conversation. So every week I talk for about this length of time, and then we open things up for Q&A. This week particularly, I didn't even mean to go blathering on that long. I wanted to open things up because I wanted to hear what folks out there, and from Newbie too, what you're thinking about this or have thought about this, what you are doing or have done, and really open this up to be a useful and in some ways even pragmatic conversation about how we talk about what's going on with students or with kids. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking. I've seen a lot of stuff happening in chat, which I have not been able to look at because I've been so earnestly engaged, but okay. Now I'm really curious to see what folks are doing. And I suppose, like Matt said, you can include that. You can include questions in the Q&A, or if there are comments you want to make, you can include them in the Q&A. And I will look through chat to see also if people put that there too. So yeah, Sarah asked, how do I prepare for the discussion of the present? Yeah, I kind of answered that, which is I don't put in anything of myself. They ask questions, and they'll say, like with protest, this really made me think about the fact that maybe there's like new ways of protesting and old ways of protesting, and maybe we're seeing two different ways of protesting clash right now, and is that the case? So that their questions were responsible, right? They weren't, for the most part, they weren't partisan. And my politics didn't matter because they're leading the way. And I told them, you are leading the way in the open space. So I think from time to time, it's clear what someone's politics are, but it has not been a confrontational space. Okay, so let's see what you folks have to say. And I'm scrolling through here. Yeah, Sarah says the challenges of faculty has become partisan. Facticity has become right, and non-commemorative history has it's true, which is why, in a way, that those open sessions aren't about facts. They're about the link between past and present. They're about, in the book we just read, there seem people being innovative about protest and people like doing old kinds of protest. Are there different kinds of protests? Was there one kind of protest during the civil rights era, and is there a different kind now? So I think it's true that facticity is a wonderful word, has itself become partisan, and there might be another occasion on which we engage with this, because that in itself is a challenge. And we can talk about that, for that matter, if we want to. Now that talking about history itself has become politicized, I know different people have different ways of confronting that, and I don't want to tell anyone they're right or wrong on that front. But I do think we can come together and figure out a useful and less useful way of engaging with students. So people are bringing example of things that they've talked about in class. Lincoln Douglas. Lincoln is a good winner and Douglas is a good loser, good leadership qualities. Right. So you go ahead, Matt. I'm scrolling through here to see.
No, we only have one question in Q&A right now. Nope, there's two. So.
Wait a minute. The mug.
And you forgot your mug, yes.
I'm sorry. That will give people more time if they want to add questions. Yeah, so for those of you who are newbies, as you put it, every week I bring a mug that has something to do with what we're talking about, and Matt has a background behind him that has something to do with what we're talking about. This week, that is, I don't know what classroom that is, but it is clearly right on target. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Matt. My mug this week is a real reach. I really was struggling, and I don't know if you're going to go along with me on this. It's a mug of St. Croix, which is where Hamilton lived as a kid.
Excellent.
That was as close as I could come.
I don't think that's a stretch. I think it's good.
Okay, yes. It is a history and kid mug.
Yes.
So okay, it is a reach but amusing. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, that really a stretch, but I was kind of proud that I found a way to make it. Okay, and is there a significance to the classroom?
Absolutely none. I had no creativity this week. I am on the struggle bus professionally right now, so I went with a one-room schoolhouse. So this is nice. And this one happens to be, just to give credit, on the campus at Missouri State University, I believe, near the College of Education, as I understand it. And so this is actually a recreation of a one-room schoolhouse, but they wanted one on their campus as the article I read anyway suggested they wanted one on their campus as sort of a historical artifact. And so I thought this is, I thought about some different options, but this is what I came up with this week. A couple questions. Catherine, and again, so this is this is a very meta moment for me because the question is about avoiding to be partisan, and half the question is pretty partisan. So I'm going to just ask the second half of the question, Catherine, with apologies, which is, how do you avoid being partisan? And I believe she's referring to your teaching.
Yeah, that's hard. It's become hard. when I first started teaching college at Yale, it was pretty easy because we really did stay in the past. And I remember my first year or two going into the classroom and hearing a discussion between the students, and they were trying to figure out my politics. I think she's liberal. Oh, I don't know. And the fact that they were doing that, I thought that was good. Nowadays, it's obviously, I think for everybody, harder. For the most part, I don't talk about, as much as I can, current people. I do talk about things like protest being a tradition, a right, and being important. I do talk about the press and why a free press is important. Those things have a partisan edge, and I realize that. They're also facts. You know, so, and I realize facts have become politicized, but for my part, I try to ground whatever I'm saying in factual evidence. Now, I will say in the last 2 or 3 years, when I've talked about freedom of the press, or I've talked about protest, particularly in my lecture courses, sometimes it makes me a little teary because it feels important in a way that it didn't before. And I think that always surprises me when I stand up in front of a big class. You know, stand up in front of 100 people and say, here's why a free press is really important. I find it hard not to feel emotional. So if people want to figure out my politics, they can look closely at my tear ducts, and I suppose that will be possible. That's how I manage it. Now, that said, I'm sure if you ask my students in my undergrad class, they would know I was liberal just because of what I laugh at or don't laugh at or whatever. So, you know, I think about all the time whether I'm seeming partisan or not. But I think that probably has to do with how your mood and how you're displaying yourself in front of students or kids, and how you're reacting to people who say things that you really disagree with. If someone says, you know, a free press isn't really important, I can say, well, let's talk about that, and let's pull in facts, and let's pull in the Constitution, and let's pull in, you know, it's there. Well, I will say there are no easy answers to the things we're talking about today, but that would be part of my answer. Matt is getting disciplined in the corner of the one-room schoolhouse.
Yes.
By one of his kids.
Yes, by both of my children who are at recess right now. So welcome to our world. No, I think those are great points about being not, you know, trying to be partisan. And I think one of the things that is evident in folks who are really well trained is the ability to sort of have that to be able to talk really fluently in what somebody who is sort of the opposite of your beliefs can do, like that counter narrative space, and you know, being able to articulate that in a way that is legitimate, I think can open up spaces, you know, just even as a quote unquote devil's advocate, which that's a sort of a term I hate, but even in using those things, those are really, really helpful methods to sort of change the space, so that because what it does is it forces people to be able to better articulate their own positions. And that's the gift of a teacher, right? That we can, or, you know, that we have the ability to mold spaces so that people are able to articulate their own positions and their own potentials in maybe different ways. And I've never seen Joanne teach other than this format, and I would suspect that she is very much in that mold. Other questions?
Let me weigh in for a minute while you're
Yes, please do. I find a question.
Okay. So Richard just talked about being in a small regional high school where keeping your politics private is pretty much not an issue. And he says after 43 years of teaching, he's been able to make it work by making sure all of the students, especially those on the opposite side of the political divide, feel the safe space that I just described. And I think that is key. And I also agree, there are some occasions when the views of the extreme ends of the spectrum must be corrected or even restricted. Racist comments of any kind, for example, yes. I don't think I've had that in the last year or two in my classes, but if they were there, I would weigh in strongly. And also, Richard says, I require accurate evidence to be used in discussion. the same, right? So particularly as history teachers, we have this to our advantage. Someone says something and we could say, okay, so let's talk about evidence. How do we show that? How do we prove that? And that's an honest historical question that can sometimes pull discussions back into a middle point that they might not have started out in.
So the question, and I got caught up looking up different answers to this, but Lois wants to know, let's see, the Burlingame letter and the day after the election made me think about civic education for my students. In the 19th century, was civic education emphasized in areas of the country or in private schools? And I can talk a little bit about the schooling aspect of it.
You go ahead and then I'll weigh in.
Yeah, so go ahead. No, go ahead and talk a little bit about civic education, sort of, or civic. General. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, in general, I find myself thinking about civic education a lot, not just like everybody else is probably thinking about it right now, but because, and I think I've mentioned this before on History Matters, I find myself thinking about Thomas Jefferson's views on education, which I know makes me an early American historian, like to the extreme, or the ultimate history geek, or whatever. At any rate, Jefferson believing that every American needed at least 3 years of schooling, and particularly needed to study history so that they would understand the threats to republics and be able to rise up and fight those threats when they appeared. They had to know them, they had to see them, which meant they had to understand the government and they had to understand history. I know that, I've taught that, I've taught it for years, but in the last 4.5 years, I've thought about that in a really different way, as I've seen people who fundamentally don't understand things like democracy or checks and balances, or why there are different branches of government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So before this point, some of that would have been incorporated. And certainly I remember, I mean, some of you out there remember having civics courses, right? So we're at a moment that maybe is, if there's a spectrum of being taught having civic education, we might be at a moment where there's less than there has been at some points in the past. But anyway, I'll stop talking there and let Matt continue.
Yeah, so no, it's good. And in terms of schooling, it's the short answer is yes, it was emphasized in many ways. That was a large focus of schools, is sort of this indoctrination into quote unquote American culture. The problem that we see, especially early, excuse me, the problem that we see, especially early on, is that we're talking about a very narrow definition of what it means to be a citizen, right? That, even going back into the common school era, the Horace Mann, et cetera, that what you're imparting is this sort of, very, very much, this sort of jingoistic formation of what American what America is, right? And this is all of that was reinforced in the books that children were reading. There's the, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of them. But there's a real popular series of books that kids were reading that, glorified heroes and talked through, that I have one from 1871 in my collection somewhere that, the depiction of Columbus working with native peoples was, in our eyes today, kind of horrific. And so, yeah, the short answer is yes, absolutely. But that has evolved over time. And so what citizenship or civic education looks like evolves, and changes with the period. What civic education looks like in the progressive era, or the 1920s, 1930s, is very different than what it would look like during Reconstruction. So I wanted just a couple, or one recommendation for a book. If you're looking for a good history of American education, William Reese's, let me pull the name up so I don't Get it? America's Public Schools from the Common School to No Child Left Behind. It's an older book, it's 2005, but it's a really nice sort of survey of of the history of American education. He did a really nice job with that. But as far as civic education, what we work with today, there's all kinds of different formulations of civic education and how that plays out in schools. And so, and now I'm acutely aware that I'm talking with my hands and nobody can see it because we talked about it at the beginning. So
I want to add something.
Wildly.
I want to add something.
Go ahead.
Related to what you just said, because it just occurred to me. I think only recently, semi-recently, have students begun to think about what it means to be a citizen. And actually, in that sense, have Americans begun to seriously think about what it means to be a citizen. When you start asking who is or who isn't in an aggressive way, that issue is going to come up. But the reason I raise that is because in my classes, I end my lecture courses by talking, the whole course, the American Revolution or Early National America, is entirely grounded in the past. The last lecture is always about being a citizen and what it means to be a citizen and how they are all citizens. And if they haven't voted before now, they should do it now, and how the future is theirs and that they have power over that. And it might sound like a, big sort of wildly general thing to say, but first of all, the fact of the matter is, of course, I get all emotional when I'm giving it because I believe that. But the other fact is, it's young people who are going to bring energy of change, right? I mean, if you look over the long haul, historically speaking, the kinds of pushes for change that have a real impact are ground up and also ones that involve young people who are thinking about their own future. So I think instilling in students what it means to be a citizen, and the fact that being an American citizen means, as I know I've talked about before on here, means being active, means being engaged, means that we don't take for granted a lot of things that I think a lot of us have taken for granted. And that's not necessarily partisan, that's just a fact, right? Citizenship matters, but it takes alertness, and democracy requires work. Those are just facts. And everything can be politicized if you want to, but I think talking about in some way that being a citizen, thinking about what it means to be a citizen is important. The other thing I just want to add to that I think someone said a little while back, Lisa maybe, about asking students what they felt at some point and having their students really emotionally talk about what they felt in class. I just wanted to highlight that because I agree with that too. Obviously, I'm not very good at hiding my feelings, but I think giving students permission to do that, to be that honest, and as several of us have said, that kind of a safe space, I think that matters a lot too. I think that makes it a different kind of a safe space. I give students permission to do that when we interpret primary sources, right? Like there's a document we just read 2 or 3 weeks ago, amazing long letter. It's a Hamilton letter. And it's like 30 pages long. Like, here's my view of the 1790s. And what's wonderful about it is that his view of the 1790s, or his view of 1792, put it that way, party politics in 1792 is Madison was my friend first, and then Jefferson took him away. So it really is the tone of it. So when we look at that, I say to my students, there are a lot of things you can pull out of here. What's your gut response? Like, what does this make you feel? And inevitably someone will say, sounds like high school. It's like, bingo. So now let's talk about what that means. So I actually also think, what does this make you feel, is not only freeing it with controversial topics, but it's just freeing because students don't feel that they have to look smart. They have to just say what they're feeling. That to me has always been a really good teaching tool. Anyway, let us go on to questions. More questions.
I just want to add one thing to that, because you brought up the younger generation, where their passions lie and how they can get involved with civic, and that remind me of Westheimer and Kahn, who wrote, this is a while back too, probably 15 years ago, they were writing about what kind of citizen, and how citizenship actually isn't a singular thing, and citizenship can can manifest in a lot of different ways. And so they identified some different ones, sort of the traditional voter, but also somebody who goes out in the community and, becomes part of an organization that's designed to develop social change. There's also people that start to challenge the structures that underlie some of the issues we're seeing. And so we see that with some of the protests now. So just thinking broadly about what citizenship is a really helpful way to engage this question in your history classrooms, right? Like when we look at what citizenship looked like during the long civil rights movement, it wasn't simply, just voting, right? There was a lot of other elements of citizenship and how that worked. In a historical sense, what that allows us to do is have conversations about history in a more dynamic way, right? And that we're not getting into those very simplistic versions of what history is. And so all of that by way of saying that what that does, that starts to help people formulate ideas about where their passions lie in terms of citizenship even today. So sorry, I'm going off on a tangent today. Poor Joanne has to listen to me. Like I'm all fired up today.
I have to say thank you to Charlie, a former student who's just beamed in from one of my seminars.
Oh, I love it. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Charlie. Who says he loves how I can quote from a massive repository of letters. I honestly, folks, like there are so many things I don't remember well, like titles of books or authors of books. But the one thing I remember always is pieces of correspondence. So Charlie, thank you for making me feel good about that. That makes me feel good. Plus, hello, former student. And my Hamilton and Jefferson seminar, which is taught entirely with primary materials, except for the first 2 weeks, which is actually, thank you, Charlie, a great example of a way to open up discussion, right? So my Hamilton Jefferson seminar, undergrad seminar, restricted to 15 students. The first 2 weeks, we read a biography of each man. And then the rest of the course is entirely their correspondence or public papers arranged thematically and basically chronologically. And we don't just talk about them, it's about the time and broader issues. But every week we have a blob of letters that we all read together, and then we talk about what they make us think. It feels, I think, as a teaching environment, much less structured because there isn't necessarily a right answer. I suppose there are some wrong answers and there are some answers that are on target, but in that sense, it relates to what I just said. Students are responding with what it makes them think and also what it makes them feel. That class, more than any other class I teach, I have no prediction as to how a discussion will go. I will walk in, if we're talking about the revolution, I'll have a couple of points that I feel are important to make that students have about revolution as in that class session, but you just never know what students are going to say. So I love teaching that class because, I learn things from my students. So that might be another sort of link to add to whatever the chain is that we're putting together here, is that primary sources, pulling away from what other people are saying as far as scholars and resorting to primary sources on that basic level might be another way to at least take a step back from being as partisan as one might be engaging with someone's argument. I love talking and using primary materials, but I think that creates a different kind of open, safe space.
And we're running short on time, but that actually leads into sort of what I think should be a good sort of ending question, which is from Emily. And Emily says, as someone who teaches history in a public space, I often have to deal with different versions of history. For example, Columbus. Sometimes people want me to affirm their version of history and get angry when I don't. Have you had this happen, and how do you deal with it?
Well,
that sort of cognitive bias.
Yeah, but it's a good answer. So I guess I've confronted that in different ways. Early on, at doing maybe my first lecture course, I was talking about different views of something. Some historians think this and some historians think that. And probably a freshman in the class, looking very anxious, raised his hand and said, well, which one's right? And looked agitated, like, which one, what do I write down? Which one is right? That to me was a wonderful teaching moment. Well, you know what? Historians argue about things, and here are different ways in which you can talk about something. That in and of itself was useful. One of my defaults when a student, I say something like, I don't know, thinking about George Washington as a slave owner is important. If someone gets mad, my sort of automatic pilot way to go is to, well, I say this almost every week, so you're getting a real sense of me as a scholar, to grab at the emotion and to say, like, man, there are some things in history that really make me mad too. Like history is one of those things that can really fire you up, but it's also complicated. And that would be the direction I would go. Mm-hmm. So in one way or another, I take what's thrown at me and try to put myself in it. I get mad at things, or sometimes whatever. Because I think if I'm honest in that way, and if I touch on the part of me that is excited by history and that loves to explore it, and that the question that student asked, rather than shutting it down, actually is a way to explore. I know that that's kind of a goofily broad and somewhat, I don't know, way too optimistic answer, but that's that strategy. I think in my scholarship and in my teaching, there's a real power in connecting with feelings. That was maybe it was the second or third History Matters that we did. We talked about feelings. I think that's a dramatically undervalued source of evidence and teaching tool. And I will, unfortunately for you, continue to repeat that in different ways. But I don't think I knew until this last book the degree to which I was that focused on that topic. But yeah, we are kind of out of time.
I just want to add one thing to that for those of you who are teachers out there. I promise I won't go on a diatribe this time. But there is some new research out there that some of my mentors are currently working on that shows that passion and engagement in complicated topics is actually really good for classrooms, especially secondary classrooms, and that having that sort of safe space to have disagreement is really important to developing true democratic dialogue.
The last thing actually I'll mention before I sign off here, someone yesterday on Twitter and today in the chat, someone talked about backstory, and I just want to mention that as a resource. So for backstory was a podcast, a history podcast, existed for about 10 years, a little over that, in which 3 historians, ultimately 4 historians actually, talked about history topics that were related to the news, but we really focused on the past. And Newbie wished he could have been part of that podcast, and yet he wasn't. It was great. I'm biased. I was in it. I was one of the co-hosts, but we would learn from each other because we would come up with a topic, and then it was improv. A lot of it was talking to each other. Also thematic, and also it's a resource base if you're teaching. And for example, yesterday I went on Twitter and said, we did an entire program on backstory about the flu in 1918. And there's a whole show. Here you go. So unfortunately it ended this summer, so there no longer are new backstories, but there's a huge, huge archive of things. So I mention that because there are segments in each show, and some shows we were even beginning to have suggestions for teaching. So it could be a useful place to go for both for entertainment, because I think they're entertaining, but also for teaching purposes. Having said that, now we're really over time. I want to say thank you to everybody who has come, as always, very much related to what we're talking about today. Thank you for engaging in this conversation. Someone in the chat today talked about how difficult it is nowadays to have this kind of dialogue, and maybe it was Tom, that we're in such a dire moment when we can't have conversations across divides, and I agree. Places like this, actually safe spaces like this, places like this where we do have these discussions and where there's a good spirit of engagement with each other, gives me hope every week. We are now going to segue, for those of you who are new, to the after party. And what that means is, and I did not name it that, I do not know the brilliant person who came up with that, who was one of our listeners, one of our audience. But what that means is we turn off the camera, we do not record it. The conversation is a little bit less formal, and we sort of open things up. So if you want to stick around for the after party, all you need to do is stick around. And otherwise, I will see you guys next week, at which point I will have figured out what it is that I'm going to talk about, since I don't know that yet. I hope that I will see some of you then. And I guess I'll say until then, folks, stay safe.
Thanks, everybody. And before we go, I just want to add one little thing, which I forgot to mention in the beginning. I just want to thank Carol Lee. I want to call Carol Lee out. She's one of our regular folks. She made a video for our STE, which was so wonderful. She talked about NCHE and History Matters, and so does Coffee. She sent really just wonderful messages this week. And I just want to publicly thank her and for her. It's really nice to see how all that works out. So with that, we're going to stop for the day and then go to our after party. Have a great one.